In the dusty train depot of Cedar Ridge, Texas, a blind schoolteacher sits alone on a wooden bench, her traveling bag clutched tight, listening to the echoes of retreating footsteps. The town elders have abandoned her here, deeming her unfit to teach their children. Miss Lila Thompson had traveled hundreds of miles based on nothing but letters and promises, only to discover that sight mattered more than wisdom to these frontier folk. Meanwhile, Jesse Colton rides into town with his mute daughter, expecting to buy feed and return to his struggling ranch. Instead, he finds a woman whose quiet dignity speaks louder than any words of protest. What he doesn't know is that this chance encounter will change everything, not just for him and his silent child, but for a town that has forgotten what it means to see with the heart. But can love truly bloom between two broken souls when an entire community stands against them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered platform of Cedar Ridge Station, where the screech of iron wheels against iron rails had long since faded into memory. Miss Lila Thompson sat with her back straight as a schoolma'am's ruler, her gloved hands folded over a worn leather satchel that contained everything she owned in this world. The depot master had disappeared into his office 20 minutes ago, leaving her alone, with nothing but the sound of wind whistling through the gaps in the wooden planks and the distant lowing of cattle from the stockyards. She had memorized every detail of the journey that brought her here, 7 days on 3 different trains, each one carrying her further from the familiar cobblestones of Boston toward this promised land of opportunity. The letters from Reverend Markham had painted Cedar Ridge as a growing frontier town hungry for education, where a qualified teacher would be welcomed with open arms and generous compensation. He had mentioned nothing about testing her credentials in person, nothing about the necessity of sight for the sacred duty of teaching. The sound of boots on wooden planks made her lift her chin. 3 sets of footsteps, she counted, approaching with the measured cadence of men who carried authority in their stride. She had heard this same rhythm in the courthouse back home, in the offices of school administrators who had politely declined her applications with pitying smiles and gentle dismissals. "Miss Thompson," came a voice she recognized from 20 minutes earlier, Reverend Markham himself, though his tone had cooled considerably since their initial greeting. "The school board has convened an emergency session to discuss your situation." She kept her voice level, drawing upon years of practice in maintaining dignity when others questioned her capabilities. "I understand there may be concerns about my condition, Reverend. Perhaps we could discuss how I've successfully taught for 8 years in Boston, or review the references I've brought from my previous positions." "Now, miss," interrupted a gruffer voice that belonged to Mayor Hutchins, a man whose political ambitions were as transparent as window glass. "You must understand our predicament. We've got children to think about, and their safety comes first. How can we trust someone who can't even see them to keep them in line?" Lila had heard variations of this conversation more times than she cared to count. The assumption that blindness meant helplessness, that her other senses hadn't sharpened to compensate for what she'd lost at the age of 12 when scarlet fever took her sight but left her mind intact. She had learned to read the subtle changes in breathing that meant a student was struggling, to hear the difference between productive discussion and brewing mischief, to sense the emotional temperature of a classroom better than many sighted teachers ever could. "Gentlemen, I have 8 years of exemplary service," she said, reaching into her satchel to retrieve a folder of carefully preserved letters. "These references speak to my ability to maintain discipline, advance student learning, and manage a classroom effectively. My students consistently scored higher on examinations than the district average." But she could hear it in their silence. The decision had already been made before they'd approached her bench. This was merely a formality, a way to assuage their consciences while they abandoned a woman who had traveled across half the continent based on their promises. "We're sure you're a fine teacher, miss," came the third voice, belonging to Dr. Whitmore, the man who served as both physician and school board secretary. "But this is frontier country. We need someone who can handle the rougher elements. Keep an eye on things, you understand?" She understood perfectly. They were afraid of being judged by neighboring towns, afraid of taking a risk on someone different, afraid of admitting they might have been wrong in their initial enthusiasm for her qualifications. Fear made cowards of even well-meaning men. "I have no means of returning to Boston," she said quietly, not as a plea but as a simple statement of fact. "The position I left has been filled. I've spent my savings on this journey." The silence that followed was heavier than a thundercloud before a storm. She heard the shuffle of feet, the clearing of throats, the rustle of fabric as they shifted uncomfortably. Finally, Reverend Markham spoke with the careful tone of a man trying to convince himself he was doing the right thing. "There's a hotel in town where you might stay while you make arrangements. Mrs. Patterson runs a respectable establishment. Perhaps you could find other employment, something more suitable to your circumstances." What he meant, of course, was something that wouldn't require them to defend their decision to the county school inspector or the territorial education board. Something that would keep her hidden away from the judgment of others, and more importantly, from their own lingering doubts about the choice they were making. As their footsteps retreated toward the main street, Lila remained on the bench, listening to the sounds of a town going about its daily business. The clip-clop of horses pulling wagons, the creak of leather and wood, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer against iron. Somewhere in that symphony of frontier life, children were playing, their laughter carrying on the dry Texas wind. Children who might have benefited from her patient instruction, her ability to reach those who struggled with traditional methods, her years of experience in nurturing young minds toward their potential. She had lost her sight as a child, but she had never lost her vision of what education could accomplish. In Boston, she had worked with students others had written off as hopeless, the immigrant children who spoke little English, the poor ones who came to school hungry, the ones whose families saw no value in book learning. She had taught them, not just arithmetic and reading, but confidence and self-worth. She had shown them that limitations existed only in the minds of those who refused to see past them. Now, sitting alone on a stranger's platform in a town that had rejected her before, giving her a chance, she felt the familiar weight of disappointment settling on her shoulders like a well-worn shawl. But beneath the disappointment was something stronger, a quiet determination that had carried her through 8 years of proving herself over and over again. She would not be broken by this setback, just as she had not been broken by the fever that stole her sight or the dozens of rejections that preceded her success in Boston. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention back to the present. Not the casual clip-clop of a town rider, but the purposeful pace of someone with work to do and places to be. The wagon wheels rolled to a stop near the platform, and she heard the creak of leather as someone dismounted. "Easy, Ruby," came a man's voice, gentle but tired. "I know you don't like coming to town, but we need supplies." There was no response from Ruby, which Lila found curious. Most children would chatter with excitement about a trip to town, or at least acknowledge their father's words. But this child remained silent, and in that silence Lila recognized something familiar. The quiet of someone who had learned that words could bring pain as easily as comfort. "Stay close to the wagon," the man continued, his boots heavy on the platform as he approached the depot office. "I'll just be a minute checking on the freight." Lila turned her head slightly, following the sound of his movement. There was something in his voice that spoke of burden carried alone, of responsibility accepted without complaint. She had heard that same tone in her own father's voice in the years after her mother's death, when he had struggled to raise a blind daughter while managing his small bookshop. The depot door opened and closed, and she heard the man's voice in Conversation with the depot master about feed delivery and freight schedules. Business matters, handled with the efficiency of someone who had little time for pleasantries. Through it all, the child remained silent, and Lila found herself wondering what sorrows had stolen this little one's voice. When the man emerged from the depot office, his footsteps paused. She could feel his attention on her, could sense the weight of his gaze as he took in her situation. A well-dressed woman, sitting alone with her traveling bag, clearly stranded and uncertain. She had learned to recognize that particular quality of attention, the way people looked at her when they were trying to decide if she needed help or if helping would be more trouble than they were prepared for. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice carrying the careful courtesy of a man raised to respect women but unsure of his ground. "Begging your pardon, but are you waiting for someone?" She turned toward his voice, tilting her head in the way she had learned made sighted people more comfortable. "I was, sir, but it appears my escort has been delayed indefinitely." There was a pause, and she could almost hear him thinking, weighing his words before speaking them. "This isn't the safest place for a lady to be waiting alone. The afternoon train doesn't come through until tomorrow, and the hotel's a fair walk from here." "I appreciate your concern," she said, maintaining the dignity that had carried her through countless difficult situations. "I'm sure I'll manage." But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if they were true. She had navigated the familiar streets of Boston with confidence, had memorized the routes from her boarding house to the school, to the market, to the church where she played piano for Sunday services. But this was foreign territory, with unfamiliar sounds and smells, with no friendly faces to ask for directions or assistance. "Pa?" came a small voice from the direction of the wagon. The first word the child had spoken, and it was colored with curiosity rather than fear. "It's all right, Ruby," the man said, and Lila could hear him moving closer to his daughter, just making sure the lady's taken care of. Ruby, a pretty name for what Lila sensed was a pretty child, though one who carried her own share of quiet sorrow. There was something in the way the man spoke to her, protective but gentle, patient in the way of someone who had learned to wait for responses that might not come. "I don't mean to impose," Lila said, though she felt the first stirrings of real concern about her circumstances. "But might I ask, is the hotel far from here?" She heard him shift his weight, heard the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather. "About 6 blocks, ma'am, through the main part of town." He paused, and she could sense his internal debate. "The thing is, well, it's not the easiest walk if you're not familiar with the streets." It was as close as he could come to acknowledging her blindness without actually stating it, and she appreciated his delicacy. So many people either ignored her condition entirely or spoke of it in whispers, as if it were something shameful rather than simply a fact of her existence. "I see," she said, then caught herself with a small smile. "Or rather, I understand. I don't suppose you could point me in the right direction." "Ma'am," he said, and there was something different in his voice now, a decision being made in real time. "I don't feel right leaving you to find your way alone. If you don't mind the company, I could walk you over to Mrs. Patterson's place." Ruby and I were heading that way anyway for supplies. It was a kindness she hadn't expected, especially after the treatment she'd received from the town's supposed leaders. Here was a stranger willing to inconvenience himself for her welfare, asking nothing in return but the chance to do what was right. "That's very generous of you, Mr. Colton, Jesse Colton, and this is my daughter Ruby, Miss Lila Thompset," she replied, extending her hand in his general direction. "I'm pleased to make your acquaintance, Mr. Colton." His hand was rough with calluses, warm and strong, the hand of a man who worked with tools and rope and the 1,000 tasks that came with ranch life. His grip was brief but steady, respectful of her femininity while acknowledging her as an equal. "The pleasure's mine, Miss Thompset," he said, and she could hear genuine warmth in his voice. "If you're ready, we can head out whenever you are." As she rose from the bench, gathering her satchel and the small traveling case that held her few possessions, Lila felt something she hadn't experienced since stepping off the train, a sense that perhaps not everyone in Cedar Ridge had hardened their hearts against strangers. Perhaps there was still room in this frontier town for the kind of decency that made civilization possible. She couldn't know, as she placed her hand on Jesse Colton's offered arm and began the walk toward an uncertain future, that this moment would be remembered by both of them as the beginning of something neither had dared to hope for. All she knew was that for the first time in hours, she was no longer alone. The walk to Patterson's hotel revealed more about Cedar Ridge than any formal introduction could have managed. Jesse Colton guided her along wooden sidewalks that creaked under their feet, past storefronts where the mingled scents of leather, coffee, and tobacco created an olfactory map of frontier commerce. Ruby walked silently beside them, her small hand occasionally brushing against Lila's skirt as they navigated around other pedestrians. "Watch the step here," Jessie murmured, as they approached what Lila assumed was the hotel entrance. "Mrs. Patterson keeps a good house, clean and respectable. She'll see you're properly settled." But even as he spoke, Lila could hear the reservation in his voice. She had learned to read the subtle undertones that betrayed a speaker's true thoughts, and something in Jesse's manner suggested he wasn't entirely confident about leaving her at the hotel. Whether that stemmed from concern for her welfare or doubts about Mrs. Patterson's establishment, she couldn't tell. The hotel lobby smelled of lye soap and old wood, with an underlying mustiness that spoke of rooms that didn't see enough air. Circulation. Mrs. Patterson herself proved to be a thin, sharp-faced woman whose greeting was correct but hardly warm. "We don't usually take special cases," she said after Jessie had explained Lila's need for accommodation. "This is a working establishment, not a charity house. Miss Thompson can pay her way," Jessie said, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "She's a school teacher from Boston, not a beggar." "Was a school teacher," Mrs. Patterson corrected, with the precision of someone who enjoyed pointing out uncomfortable truths. "Word travels fast in a small town, Mr. Colton. Everyone knows about the school." Board's decision. Lila felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "What are your rates, Mrs. Patterson? I require only a simple room. $2 a night. Meals extra," came the crisp reply. "Payment in advance." It was highway robbery, and everyone in the room knew it. Lila had stayed in far better accommodations in Dallas for half that price, but she was in no position to negotiate, and Mrs. Patterson clearly knew it. As Lila reached into her reticule for the money, she heard Ruby whisper something to her father. The child's voice was so soft that Lila couldn't make out the words, but Jessie's response was immediate and gentle. "What do you think, little one?" he asked, and Lila caught the sound of him kneeling to Ruby's level. "You think Miss Thompson might like to see the ranch instead?" Ruby's response was another whisper, and this time Lila caught a few words. Lonely and sad, and something that might have been help. Jessie was quiet for a long moment, and Lila could sense him wrestling with a decision that went far beyond simple charity. When he finally spoke, his words surprised everyone in the room, probably including himself. "Miss Thompson," he said, rising to his full height, "I know this is presumptuous, and you're perfectly free to refuse, but Ruby and I have a proposition." "For you?" Lila turned toward his voice, trying to read his intentions in the careful way he chose his words. "My ranch is about 5 miles out of town," he continued. "It's not much to look at, but it's clean and quiet, and Ruby could use some learning that I'm not equipped to provide. If you'd consider staying with us for a while, teaching Ruby her letters and numbers, I could offer you room and board in exchange." The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Patterson's shocked intake of breath was audible, and Lila could practically feel the woman's disapproval radiating across the lobby. But beneath the social impropriety of a single man offering shelter, to an unmarried woman, Lila sensed something else entirely, a father's desperate love for his child, and a recognition that Ruby needed something he couldn't give her. "Mr. Colton," she said carefully, "that's very generous, but I wouldn't want to impose on your household or create any difficulties. The only difficulty, he said, and there was something almost fierce in his voice, would be leaving a decent woman to face Mrs. Patterson's hospitality when there's a better option available. Mrs. Patterson sputtered indignantly, but Jessie continued as if she hadn't spoken. Ruby's 8 years old, and she's bright as a new penny. But she hasn't had proper schooling, and I'm not much good with books and such. If you're willing to teach to her, you'd be doing us the favor, not the other way around. Lila felt Ruby move closer to her, close enough that she could sense the child's stillness, the way she held her breath waiting for the answer. There was something about this little girl's quiet presence that tugged at Lila's heart, a recognition of kindred spirits perhaps, both of them outsiders in their own ways. I would need to maintain my independence, Lila said slowly, thinking through the implications. I wouldn't want to be seen as, that is, I would insist on contributing to the household expenses. That's fair, Jessie said immediately. Ruby's education is worth more than room and board to me. It was Mrs. Patterson who broke the spell of the moment, her voice sharp with scandalized concern. Mr. Colton, surely you can't be serious about this arrangement. What will people say? An unmarried woman living under your roof. The very idea is— The idea, Jessie interrupted, and his voice had gone quiet in a way that suggested real anger, is that a child deserves an education, and a decent woman deserves better treatment than she's received in this town today. Ruby tugged at her father's sleeve, and when he bent down, she whispered something that made him smile for the first time since Lila had met him. Ruby says you have kind eyes, he reported, straightening up. She's got good instincts about people. Lila felt tears prick at her own eyes, not from pity, but from the unexpected gift of a child's acceptance. Thank you, Ruby. That's one of the nicest things anyone has said to me in a very long time. The decision, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. Mr. Colton, if you're certain the arrangement wouldn't be an imposition, I would be honored to accept your offer. The wagon ride to the Colton Ranch gave Lila her first real sense of the Texas landscape that would become her new home. The air was different here, drier, carrying scents of sage and dust, and something indefinably wild that spoke of vast open spaces. Jessie kept up a gentle commentary as they traveled, describing the terrain and landmarks with the unconscious skill of someone accustomed to helping others navigate unfamiliar territory. Creek runs along our eastern boundary, he explained as they forded a shallow stream. Good water year-round, which is more than some folks can say. Adobe house sits on a little rise, catches the evening breeze. Ruby rode between them on the wagon seat, her silence now comfortable rather than strained. Occasionally, she would lean against Lila's arm, a shy gesture of acceptance that warmed Lila's heart more than any words could have done. The house, when they reached it, was smaller than Lila had expected, but solidly built. Jessie helped her down from the wagon with gentle hands, then guided her up 3 wooden steps to a covered porch that creaked pleasantly under their feet. It's not fancy, he said, and she could hear apology in his voice. Sarah always meant to fix it up some, add curtains and such, but after well, Ruby and I manage well enough. The mention of his late wife brought a moment of awkwardness, a recognition of the complexity of their arrangement. Lila was entering a house that still held the memory of another woman, a mother whose loss had left both father and daughter adrift in ways they were still learning to navigate. I'm sure it's lovely, Lila said, and meant it. A house's warmth had nothing to do with its furnishings, and everything to do with the love it contained. The interior smelled of wood smoke and leather, with undertones of coffee and something that might have been lavender, perhaps from soap or sachets, left behind by the woman who had once made this place a home. Jessie guided her through rooms that felt spacious despite their modest size, describing the layout with the practical efficiency of a man unaccustomed to entertaining guests. Kitchens through here, he said, leading her past what she assumed was the main living area. Ruby's room is off to the left, mine's to the right. There's a small room at the back that Sarah used for sewing. It's got a window and a good bed. If it suits you." Lila followed him to the room that would become her sanctuary, her hands trailing along the doorframe as she entered. The space felt peaceful, with afternoon sunlight warming her face through what must have been a west-facing window. A bed, a washstand, a chair by the window. Everything she needed for simple comfort. "It's perfect," she said, setting her satchel down on the bed. More than perfect. That first evening established the routines that would shape their days together. Jesse prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, apologizing for his limited culinary skills, while Ruby set the table with careful precision. They ate by lamplight, the conversation tentative but growing warmer as the night progressed. Lila learned that Jesse had been widowed for 2 years, that he ran cattle on land that had been in his family since before the war, that he struggled with the isolation that came with ranch life. Ruby, she discovered through patient observation, was indeed bright as her father claimed, but carried a sadness that went deeper than simple grief. She used to chatter like a magpie, Jesse said, quietly after Ruby had gone to bed, always asking questions, making up stories about everything she saw. After Sarah died, it's like she decided words weren't safe anymore. Lila understood that feeling more than she could explain. Words had power to heal or harm, and a child who had experienced loss might well decide that silence was safer than risking further pain. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "children need time to find their voices again, and sometimes they need someone who understands that silence isn't the same as emptiness." Jesse was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of hope that nearly broke her heart. "I don't know much about teaching," he said, "but I know Ruby needs something I can't give her. If you can help her find her way back to herself, well, there's nothing I wouldn't do to repay that debt." As Lila settled into the small sewing room that night, listening to the sounds of a ranch at rest, the lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through grass, the settling of wood in cooling air, she reflected on the strange turns that had brought her to this place. She had come to Cedar Ridge expecting to teach in a proper schoolhouse, to board with a respectable family, to rebuild her life according to conventional expectations. Instead, she found herself in the home of a widowed rancher preparing to tutor a grieving child, entering into an arrangement that would scandalize the very people who had rejected her services. But as she drifted towards sleep, Lila felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of being exactly where she was meant to be. In the next room, Ruby lay awake, clutching a wooden doll that had been her mother's last gift, wondering if the lady with the kind voice would stay, or if she too would disappear like everything else good in Ruby's small world. And down the hall, Jesse Colton stared at the ceiling, grateful for his daughter's unexpected wisdom and terrified by the possibility that he might have found something he didn't deserve to keep. The first week at the Colton Ranch unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance, each of them learning the steps to an arrangement none had experienced before. Lila woke each morning to the sound of Jesse moving about the kitchen, the clink of coffee pot against stove, the gentle murmur of his voice as he spoke to Ruby in tones too soft for Lila to distinguish the words. By the time she emerged from her room, dressed and ready for the day, he would have breakfast waiting, simple fare prepared with an attention to her needs that touched her more deeply than elaborate gestures might have done. "Coffee's on the table to your left," he would say, guiding her without making her feel helpless. "Eggs are still warm in the skillet." Ruby would already be seated, eating with the quiet concentration of a child who had learned to find comfort. In routine, she responded to Lila's gentle questions with nods and shakes of her head, occasionally venturing a whispered, "Yes, ma'am," or "No, ma'am," but never volunteering conversation of her own. On the third morning, Lila made a discovery that changed everything. While exploring the kitchen after Jessie had gone out to tend the cattle, she ran her fingers along the shelves and found a collection of cookbooks, their pages worn soft with "use." One fell open in her hands, and she realized with a start that it was filled with handwritten recipes in a feminine script that could only have belonged to Sarah Colton. "She was a fine cook," came Jessie's voice from the doorway, startling Lila so that she nearly dropped the precious book. "Always trying new things, making our simple ingredients taste like something special." "I'm sorry," Lila said, carefully closing the cookbook. "I didn't mean to pry." "No need to apologize." His footsteps crossed the kitchen, and she heard him. "Pour another cup of coffee. Ruby likes to look at her mama's writing sometimes, says it helps her remember." That afternoon, with Jessie's permission, Lila began experimenting with Sarah's recipes. Her fingers traced the careful instructions for cornbread with molasses, for stew seasoned with herbs that grew wild along the creek, for the apple tart that had been Jessie's favorite. Ruby became her assistant, describing the contents of jars and tins, guiding Lila's hands to the right ingredients. "Mama always put a pinch of cinnamon in the cornbread," Ruby whispered, the longest sentence she had spoken since Lila's arrival. "Said it made it taste like happiness." The first meal Lila prepared from Sarah's recipes was a revelation for all of them. The familiar flavors seemed to unlock something in Ruby's memory, and she spoke more during that one supper than she had in the previous 3 days combined. Jessie ate in reverent silence, and Lila could hear the weight of memory in his breathing. "Sarah would have liked you," he said, as they cleared the table together. "She always believed in seeing the best in people, in giving folks a chance to prove themselves." By the end of the week, they had settled into rhythms that felt natural despite their newness. Mornings belonged to household tasks and Ruby's informal lessons. Lila would sit with the child on the front porch, using her fingers to trace letters in the dirt, teaching Ruby to recognize words by their shape and sound. Ruby proved to be as quick as her father had claimed, picking up reading with an eagerness that spoke of a mind hungry for knowledge. "What does this spell?" Lila would ask, her finger tracing letters in Ruby's palm. "Cat," Ruby would respond, or sun or home, her voice growing stronger with each small success. Afternoons were spent in practical education, cooking, mending, the dozens of skills that made frontier life possible. Lila discovered that her other senses served her well in these tasks. She could judge the doneness of bread by its aroma, could tell when butter was properly churned by the sound of the churn, could mend tears in fabric by feel alone. But it was the evenings that truly bound them together as a family unit. After supper, they would sit in the front room while Lila told stories. Tales from her childhood in Boston, adventures from the books she had memorized, gentle fables that carried lessons about kindness and courage. Ruby would curl up against her father's side, but her attention was entirely focused on Lila's voice, and gradually she began to respond with questions and comments of her own. "Tell about the princess who couldn't see," Ruby requested one evening, referring to a story Lila had adapted from her own experience. "Ah," Lila said, settling more comfortably in her chair. "The princess who couldn't see was the wisest in all the kingdom, because she had learned to listen with her heart." These moments of quiet connection were interrupted on Friday morning by the arrival of unexpected visitors. Lila was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, guided by Ruby's patient directions, when the sound of approaching horses made them both freeze. "3 riders," Ruby whispered, and there was fear in her voice that made Lila's heart clench. Jessie emerged from the barn where he had been repairing harness, his boots striking the ground with unusual force. "Ruby, take Miss Thompson inside," he said, his voice carefully controlled. But Lila could hear the tension in his words, could sense the way his body had gone rigid with protective instincts. She followed Ruby toward the house but remained on the back porch, listening as the riders approached the front of the property. "Colton," came a voice she recognized. Mayor Hutchins, though his tone was far less cordial than it had been at the train station. "We need to have a word." "Morning, Mayor," Jesse replied, and Lila could hear him moving to position himself between the riders and the house. "What brings you out this way?" "I think you know," came a second voice. "Dr. Whitmore, the school board secretary. Word is, you've got that blind woman living out here. People are talking, Jesse. It doesn't look right." Ruby's hand found Lila's, small fingers gripping tight with the intensity of a child who sensed adult conflicts she didn't fully understand. Lila squeezed back, offering what comfort she could while straining to hear Jesse's response. "Miss Thompson is teaching Ruby," Jesse said, his voice level but firm. "She's earning her keep, and she's welcome here as long as she chooses to stay." "Now, son," came a third voice. Reverend Markham, trying for the reasonable tone of a pastor, mediating a dispute. "You must see how this appears to decent folk, an unmarried woman living under your roof. It's just not proper." "What's not proper," Jesse said, and there was iron in his voice now, "is a town that abandons a qualified teacher at a train station because they're too afraid to take a chance on someone different." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Lila could picture the three men exchanging glances, weighing their next words carefully. When Mayor Hutchins spoke again, his tone had hardened. "We're not here to debate the school board's decision, Colton. We're here because your arrangement is causing problems. Good families are concerned about the example being set. Children are asking questions their parents don't want to answer." "Then maybe their parents should examine their own consciences," Jesse replied. "Miss Thompson is a lady in every sense of the word. If folks want to see scandal where none exists, that says more about them than it does about us." Ruby's grip on Lila's hand tightened, and Lila could feel the child trembling. This was exactly what she had feared, that her presence would bring trouble to the man who had shown her kindness. She began to step forward, ready to announce that she would return to town rather than cause further difficulty, but Ruby's whispered, "No," stopped her. "Please don't go," the child breathed, her voice barely audible. "Papa needs you. I need you." The simple words hit Lila like a physical blow. In 1 week, this silent, wounded child had come to depend on her presence, had begun to heal in ways that filled Lila with fierce protectiveness. Whatever the cost to her own reputation, she could not abandon Ruby now. "The bank note on this property comes due in 3 months, Dr. Whitmore was saying, his voice carrying a subtle threat. "It would be unfortunate if certain irregularities made it difficult for you to secure favorable terms for renewal. The implication was clear: conform to their expectations or face financial ruin." Lila felt anger burn in her chest, not for herself, but for Jesse, who was being punished for his decency, and for Ruby, whose healing was being threatened by small-minded prejudice. "I appreciate your concern, gentlemen," Jesse said, his courtesy razor-sharp with sarcasm. "But my arrangements are my own business. Good day." The sound of horses departing was followed by Jesse's heavy footsteps as he circled the house to find them. His face, when he appeared, was set in grim lines that spoke of a man pushed to his limits. "I'm sorry you had to hear that," he said too. "Lila," his voice gentle despite the anger she could sense simmering beneath the surface. "I should go," Lila said quietly. "I won't be the cause of your losing this ranch, Mr. Colton. Ruby needs a home more than she needs a teacher." "No," Jesse said, the word sharp with finality. "Running away won't solve anything. They'll just find another excuse to cause trouble." Ruby stepped between them, her small face fierce with determination. "Don't let them win, Papa. Don't let them take Miss Lila away like they took Mama." The words hung in the air like a bell's toll, and Lila realized that for Ruby, this was about more than education or propriety. This was about whether the adults in her life would fight for what mattered or surrender to forces beyond their control. Jesse knelt to his daughter's level, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "What do you think we should do, little one?" Ruby looked from her father to Lila, her young face serious with the weight of decision. "We should show them that families come in all kinds," she said, her voice stronger than Lila had ever heard it, and that love is more important than what people think. As the three of them stood together on the back porch of the ranch house, surrounded by the vastness of Texas sky and the subtle sounds of cattle and wind, Lila felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since losing her sight, she was not alone in fighting for her place in the world. She had allies now, a man whose quiet strength matched her own determination, and a child whose wisdom exceeded her years. The battle was far from over, but they would face it together. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after the confrontation with the town delegation. Lila was working with Ruby on her arithmetic, using dried beans to help the child visualize addition and subtraction, when Ruby suddenly set down her slate and picked up the chalk with purposeful determination. "What are you working on, sweetheart?" Lila asked, hearing the careful scratching of chalk against slate. Ruby didn't answer immediately, her tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated on forming letters with painstaking care. When she finally finished, she placed the slate in Lila's hands with the solemnity of someone presenting a precious gift. Lila's fingers traced the uneven letters, feeling the deep grooves where Ruby had pressed hard to ensure clarity. THANKYOU, spelled out in a child's careful handwriting, followed by something that might have been a drawing of a flower. "Oh, Ruby," Lila whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This is beautiful. What made you decide to write this?" "Because," Ruby said, settling closer to Lila on the porch step, "you're the first person who listens to me even when I don't talk. Mama used to do that too." It was the longest speech Ruby had made since Lila's arrival, and the comparison to her late mother was both humbling and deeply moving. Lila pulled the child closer, breathing in the scent of soap and sunshine that clung to Ruby's hair. "Your mama must have been very wise," Lila said, "and you're just like her. You see things that other people miss." Ruby was quiet for a moment, then asked the question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. "Are you going to leave like Mama did?" The simple inquiry cut straight to Lila's heart. She understood now that Ruby's silence hadn't been just about grief. It had been about fear of attachment, about the terrible lesson that people you loved could disappear without warning. "Your mama didn't choose to leave, sweetheart," Lila said, carefully. "Sometimes life takes people away from us, and it's not because they wanted to go. But I'm choosing to stay for as long as your papa will have me. Even if the mean people in town try to make you go." Lila heard footsteps on the porch and sensed Jesse settling into the chair behind them. He had been listening, she realized, giving them space for this important conversation while remaining close enough to offer support if needed. "Even then," Lila promised, "it takes more than mean words to scare me away from people I care about." That afternoon, Ruby's newfound confidence, with written words extended to spoken ones as well. She chattered excitedly as they prepared lunch, describing the antics of the barn cats, the progress of the vegetable garden, the way her father sang off-key when he thought no one was listening. It was as if a dam had burst, releasing months of pent-up observations and questions. "Miss Lila," Ruby said, as they stirred the soup that would be their midday meal, "do you ever wish you could see me?" It was an innocent question, but one that required a thoughtful answer. Lila had learned that children needed honesty about difficult topics, but delivered with care and age-appropriate explanation. "Sometimes I wonder what you look like," Lila admitted, "but I can see you in other ways. I can see your kindness when you help me find things. I can see your intelligence when you solve arithmetic problems. I can see your beautiful spirit when you laugh." Ruby considered this seriously. "Papa says I have Mama's eyes. They're brown like coffee with cream." "That sounds lovely," Lila said. "What else do you look like?" "I'm small for 8, but Papa says I'll catch up. My hair is yellow like corn silk, and I lost 2 teeth, but new ones are growing in." Ruby paused, then added with the brutal honesty of childhood, "Mrs. Henderson says I'm pretty, but Mrs. Patterson says I'm too wild to be a proper lady." Lila felt a flare of anger at the unknown Mrs. Patterson's thoughtless comment. Being spirited isn't the same as being wild, Ruby. And being a proper lady means being kind and honest and true to yourself, not sitting quietly with your hands folded. Is that why Papa likes you? Because you're a proper lady but not a boring one. The question was so unexpected that Lila nearly dropped her spoon. What makes you think your papa likes me? She asked, trying to keep her voice casual. He smiles. When you're not looking, Ruby said matter-of-factly, and he talks to you different than he talks to other people. Softer, like how he used to talk to Mama. Before Lila could formulate a response to this uncomfortable insight, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. But this time, the riders weren't coming to cause trouble. They were coming for help. Jessie emerged from the barn at a run, reaching the front yard just as a man Lila didn't recognize slid down from his lathered horse. "Colton, thank God you're here," the stranger panted. "It's my boy, thrown from his horse about 2 miles back. He's hurt bad, unconscious. Doc Whitmore's out of town, and I don't know what else to do." Jessie didn't hesitate. "Ruby, get my medical kit from the kitchen. Miss Thompson, can you help? You might know things I don't about head injuries." Lila's mind raced through her limited medical knowledge, mostly gleaned from caring for her father during his final illness and from the practical first aid that was part of every teacher's training. "I'll do what I can," she said. The injured boy was 12 years old, unconscious but breathing steadily. While Jessie examined him for broken bones, Lila carefully felt around the child's head, finding a significant swelling behind his left ear, but no depression that might indicate a skull fracture. "Concussion, most likely," she said quietly to Jessie. "The swelling suggests the brain is bruised, but the skull seems intact. We need to keep him still and watch for changes in his breathing." Working together, they managed to get the boy to the ranch house, where Lila directed the creation of a quiet, darkened room that would be conducive to healing. Ruby proved invaluable, following instructions with calm efficiency that belied her 8 years. For 6 hours, they took turns monitoring the patient while his father paced anxiously in the front room. Lila found herself falling naturally into the role of nurse, her careful attention to sound and touch allowing her to detect changes in the boy's condition that might have been missed by visual examination alone. When the child finally woke, confused but coherent, his father's relief was palpable. "I can't thank you enough," he said to Jessie, then turned to include Lila. "Both of you, if it hadn't been for your quick thinking." Word of the incident spread through Cedar Ridge with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. But this time, the story worked in their favor. The injured boy was the son of Tom Mitchell, a respected rancher whose opinion carried weight in the community. His glowing account of Lila's medical knowledge and steady hands in a crisis began to shift public perception. "That blind teacher of yours," Tom told anyone who would listen, "she's got more sense and skill than half the doctors I've met. My boy might not have made it without her quick thinking." The change wasn't universal. Mrs. Patterson and her circle of disapproving ladies still clucked about propriety and scandal. But other voices began to join the conversation, people who had witnessed Lila's competence and grace under pressure. Mrs. Sarah Henderson, wife of the general store owner, made a point of stopping by the ranch the following Sunday. "I wanted to thank you proper," she told Lila, as they sat on the front porch sharing coffee and conversation. "What you did for the Mitchell boy, well, it shows the measure of a person. Anyone who says you don't belong in this community doesn't know what they're talking about." Ruby beamed with pride, and Jessie's quiet satisfaction was evident in the way he moved around his own property, straighter, more confident, like a man who no longer felt the need to apologize for his choices. That evening, as they settled into their usual routine of story time after supper, Ruby made an announcement that surprised them both. "I want to write a letter," she said, holding up her slate with determination, "to the school board. I want to tell them they made a mistake." Jessie started to protest. A child shouldn't be involved in adult conflicts, but Lila held up a hand. "What would you want to say in this letter?" she asked Ruby. that Miss Lila is the best teacher in the whole world, and that they're stupid if they can't see that. Ruby's face was fierce with righteous indignation. And that being blind doesn't mean you can't help people, it just means you help them different. Those are important thoughts, Lila said carefully, but perhaps we could find a way to express them that might help the school board understand rather than making them feel attacked. They spent the next hour crafting Ruby's letter with Lila, guiding her toward language that was respectful but firm, that shared specific examples of learning and growth rather than mere opinion. When it was finished, Ruby read it aloud with pride, her voice clear and strong. "Should we send it?" she asked her father. Jessie looked at Lila, seeking her opinion. She nodded slowly. Sometimes the most powerful arguments came from the most unexpected. Sources and Ruby's innocent honesty might accomplish what adult reasoning could not. "I think," Jessie said, "that the school board needs to hear from their most important critic." As Ruby carefully folded her letter and placed it in an envelope addressed in her careful handwriting, Lila reflected on how much had changed in just 2 weeks. The silent, withdrawn child she had first met was becoming a confident young woman with strong opinions and the courage to express them. The arrangement that had begun as simple charity was evolving into something deeper and more complex, and Jessie, quiet, protective Jessie, was beginning to look at her with an expression she couldn't see but could feel in the way the air seemed to change when he was near. Ruby was right. He did speak to her differently, with a gentleness that suggested feelings neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. The battle for acceptance in Cedar Ridge was far from over, but they were no longer fighting it alone. They had allies now, and more importantly, they had each other. A makeshift family bound together by choice rather than blood, by love rather than obligation. The letter from First National Bank of Cedar Ridge arrived on a Thursday morning in October, delivered by a grim-faced postal clerk who seemed to take personal satisfaction in bearing unwelcome news. Jessie read it twice before setting it down on the kitchen table with the careful deliberation of a man handling dynamite. Lila, who had been helping Ruby with her penmanship at the same table, heard the change in Jessie's breathing and felt the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere that meant trouble had arrived. "What is it?" she asked quietly, her fingers automatically moving to cover Ruby's hand in a gesture of protection. Jessie was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to press against the walls of their small kitchen. "Bank's calling in the note. Full payment due in 30 days, or they foreclose on the property." The words fell between them, like stones into still water, creating ripples of implication that spread outward to touch every aspect of their carefully constructed life. Ruby's hand went rigid under Lila's, and she could hear the child's breathing quicken with the anxiety that always accompanied adult crises. "How much?" Lila asked, though she dreaded the answer. $800. Jessie's laugh was bitter and entirely without humor. "Might as well be 8,000. I've got maybe 50 in cash, and the cattle won't bring enough at market to cover even half." Lila's mind raced through possibilities, calculating and discarding options with the efficiency of someone trained to solve problems under pressure. She had her savings, modest but carefully preserved from her years of teaching in Boston. It wouldn't be enough to cover the full amount, but it might provide a foundation for negotiation. "I have some money put aside," she said carefully, testing the waters of a conversation that could change everything between them. "About $300. It's not enough to solve the problem, but perhaps it could help." The silence that followed was profound and complicated. She could sense Jessie's internal struggle. Pride warring with desperation, gratitude battling with the masculine need to provide and protect rather than be rescued by the woman he had taken in out of charity. "I can't take your money, Lila," he said finally, using her given name for the first time since she'd arrived at the ranch. The intimacy of it sent warmth through her chest, even as her heart ached for his obvious pain. "It wouldn't be taking," she said, choosing her words with the precision of someone navigating a minefield. "It would be investing. This ranch is Ruby's. Inheritance, her future security. I have a stake in that future now." Ruby looked up from her slate, her young face serious with understanding beyond her years. "Are we going to lose our home, Papa?" Jesse's hand reached out to smooth his daughter's hair, the gesture automatic and infinitely tender. "Not if I can. Help it, little one. Your papa's got some thinking to do, but we'll figure something out." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, Lila could hear the doubt beneath them. The bank's timing was no coincidence. This was Dr. Whitmore's promised retaliation for Jesse's refusal to conform to town expectations. They were being punished not for financial irresponsibility, but for moral independence. That afternoon, while Ruby worked on her reading lesson, Lila and Jesse sat on the front porch discussing options with the kind of desperate practicality that came with having one's back against the wall. "I could sell off part of the herd," Jesse said, though his tone suggested he knew it was a futile gesture. "Might raise 200 if I'm lucky, but that leaves us short and with no income for next year." "What about taking on additional work?" Lila suggested. "Surely there are ranchers who need extra hands for the winter season." "Maybe," Jesse agreed, but without enthusiasm. "Problem is, most of the big spreads have their crews set for the season, and working for wages means leaving you and Ruby alone here, which isn't safe with feelings running as high as they are in town." The truth of this hung between them like a storm cloud. The hostility toward their arrangement had only intensified since the Mitchell boy incident, as if Lila's competence in a crisis had somehow made her more rather than less threatening to certain segments of the community. "There might be another option," Lila said slowly, an idea taking shape that was both audacious and potentially disastrous. "What if we gave them exactly what they claimed to want?" Jesse turned toward her, and she could feel his attention sharpening. "What do you mean?" "They say our arrangement is improper because we're unmarried people living under the same roof," Lila continued, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "What if we changed that situation?" The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither quite dared to examine too closely. Lila felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized how her suggestion might be interpreted, how presumptuous it might seem. "Lila," Jesse said, his voice carefully controlled, "are you saying what I think you're saying?" Before she could answer, Ruby's voice interrupted from the doorway. "Papa, there's someone coming up the road." The approaching rider proved to be Tom Mitchell, the man whose son they had helped weeks earlier. His face was grave as he dismounted and approached the porch, hat in hand with the formal courtesy that meant serious business. "Jesse, Miss Thompset," he said with a nod to each of them. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I heard about your troubles with the bank." News traveled fast in a small community, especially news of misfortune. Lila wondered how many other neighbors already knew about their predicament and what they thought of it. "Word gets around," Jesse said with resigned acceptance. "Can't say I'm surprised." "The thing is," Tom continued, settling into the chair Jesse offered him, "some of us have been talking. What happened to the Mitchell boy could have happened to any of our children. You two didn't hesitate to help, didn't ask for payment or thanks, just did what needed doing." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts before continuing. "There's been talk in town about starting a subscription school, parents paying directly for their children's education instead of waiting for the county to get its act together. Some folks think Miss Thompset here would be just the teacher. And for the job," Lila felt her breath catch. "A subscription school would solve multiple problems at once, providing her with legitimate employment, giving local children access to education, and potentially generating enough income to help with the ranch's financial crisis." "Who's been talking about this?" Jesse asked, his voice carefully neutral. Well, Sarah Henderson, for one. The Mitchells, of course. Bill Morrison's got 3 young ones who need schooling. Even Pastor Williams thinks it might be a good idea, though he's keeping quiet about it for now. Tom shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the political implications of what he was suggesting. The thing is, it would have to be unofficial at first. Can't go through the regular school board, not with the way things stand. But if enough families signed on, paid their fees in advance. How much are we talking about? Lila asked, hardly daring to hope. Figure $2 a month per child, maybe $3 for the older ones who need more advanced work. If we could get 15 families committed, that's good money for honest work. Jesse was quiet, calculating. $45 a month would make a significant difference in their financial situation, though it still wouldn't be enough to satisfy the bank's immediate demands. There's something else, Tom said, clearly saving the most important information for last. My brother-in-law owns the old Henderson place on the edge of town. Been sitting empty since old man Henderson died. Has a big front room that would make a fine classroom, and he'd be willing to rent it reasonable to a school. The offer was more generous than they had any right to expect. But Lila could sense the complications, even as her heart leapt with possibility. Teaching in town would mean daily exposure to the very people who had rejected her, would require a courage she wasn't certain she possessed. I appreciate the offer, Tom, Jesse said slowly. But Miss Thompson's safety has to come first. There are folks in town who've made their feelings pretty clear about her being here. That's true, Tom admitted. But there are more folks than you might think who are ashamed of how she was treated. Sometimes it takes a crisis to show people what really matters. Ruby, who had been listening from the doorway with the intensity of a child whose future was being decided, finally spoke up. I think Miss Lila should do it, she said, her voice clear and confident. She's the best teacher in the world, and other children should get to learn from her too. The simple declaration from an 8-year-old carried more weight than any adult argument might have done. Here was the child who had been transformed by Lila's patient teaching, who had found her voice and her confidence under Lila's guidance. Her endorsement was proof of what was possible. I need time to think about this, Lila said finally. It's a generous offer, but there are risks involved for everyone. I wouldn't want to cause more trouble for the families who are trying to help. Fair enough, Tom said, rising from his chair. But don't take too long deciding. School ought to start soon if it's going to start at all, and winter's coming, whether we're ready or not. After Tom had gone, the 3 of them sat in contemplative silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the opportunities and dangers the proposal represented. Finally, Ruby broke the quiet with a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. Papa, if Miss Lila teaches in town, does that mean she won't live with us anymore? It was the question they had all been avoiding, the one that made the financial solution feel like an emotional catastrophe. If Lila took the teaching position, propriety would demand that she find other living arrangements. The very success that might save the ranch could destroy the family they had built together. Jesse looked at Lila, his eyes holding a question he seemed afraid to voice. She met his gaze, her own heart full of words she wasn't certain she had the right to speak. Not necessarily, she said carefully. There might be ways to make it work, to satisfy both propriety and practical needs. But even as she spoke, Lila knew that the simple solution Tom Mitchell had offered was actually the most complicated choice they could make. Success in town would mean public scrutiny of their private arrangements, would force them to define their relationship in ways they had so far avoided. The question was no longer whether she could teach the children of Cedar Ridge, but whether she and Jesse had the courage to build something real and lasting in the face of a community that seemed determined to tear them apart. The teaching certificate arrived by mail on a grey November morning, forwarded from Boston, along with a letter that would change everything. Lila recognized the official seal of the Massachusetts State Board of Education, before Jessie finished reading the return address, and her heart began beating with the irregular rhythm of hope mixed with dread. "It's from your old supervisor," Jessie said, settling the envelope carefully in her hands. "Feels like there might be documents inside." Lila's fingers traced the heavy paper, feeling for the telltale thickness that would indicate official correspondence. Whatever news the letter contained had been important enough to warrant expensive postage and formal documentation. "Would you like me to read it?" Jessie asked, his voice gentle with understanding. Over the weeks they had lived together, he had become adept at offering help without making her feel diminished, at respecting her independence while acknowledging the practical limitations her blindness sometimes imposed. "Please," she said, settling into the kitchen chair that had become hers by unspoken agreement. Ruby abandoned her arithmetic lesson to move closer, sensing that adult business was about to unfold that might affect her small world. Jessie's voice was careful and measured as he began to read. "Dear Miss Thompson, I hope this letter finds you well in your new position in Texas. I am writing to inform you of recent developments here in Boston that may be of interest to you." He paused, and Lila could hear the rustle of paper as he scanned ahead, preparing her for whatever revelation was coming. "The investigation into the circumstances surrounding your departure from the Beacon Hill Academy has been completed. I am pleased to inform you that all charges against you have been dismissed, and your name has been fully cleared of any wrongdoing." Lila felt the breath leave her lungs as if she had been struck. The accusations that had driven her from Boston, the whispered suggestions that she had been inappropriate with students, the implications that her blindness made her vulnerable to manipulation, had followed her across the continent like shadows. To learn that they had been officially disproven felt like stepping from darkness into sunlight. Jessie continued reading, his voice growing stronger as the news improved. "Mr. Harrison Blackwood has been dismissed from his position and faces criminal charges for his conduct toward several students. Your courage in protecting young Timothy Morrison from his advances, despite the personal cost to yourself, has been recognized by the board as an act of moral heroism." Ruby's small hand found Lila's, squeezing tight with the fierce loyalty of a child who had always known her teacher was special. "What does that mean, Miss Lila?" she asked softly. "It means," Lila said, her voice thick with emotion, "that sometimes doing the right thing takes a long time to be recognized as right." Jessie cleared his throat and continued. "The board would be honored to offer you reinstatement to your former position, with a promotion to head teacher and a substantial increase in salary. Your innovative teaching methods and dedication to students from all backgrounds are sorely missed here. We await your response at your earliest convenience." The silence that followed was profound and complicated. Reinstatement in Boston meant vindication, financial security, and a return to the world she had known and understood. It meant respect and professional recognition, a chance to build the career she had always dreamed of having. It also meant leaving Texas, leaving Jessie, leaving Ruby, leaving the life that had grown around her like a garden she had never planned but couldn't bear to abandon. "There's more," Jessie said quietly, and she could hear him unfolding additional papers. These looked like legal documents. The certificates were official copies of her teaching credentials, updated with notations that cleared her record of any misconduct. More valuable than gold, these papers represented her professional identity restored, her reputation rebuilt from the ashes of scandal. "They sent everything," she said wonderingly, running her fingers over the raised seals that made the documents official. "Full reinstatement, cleared record, even a promotion." "That's wonderful news," Jessie said, and she could hear him trying to inject enthusiasm into his voice, despite what the letter meant for their future together. "You'll be able to teach anywhere now, with credentials like these." Ruby was less diplomatic in her response. "You're not going to leave us, are you?" she asked, her voice small and frightened. "You said you were choosing to stay." The question hung in the air like a sword, cutting straight to the heart of the dilemma Lila now faced. She had promised Ruby she wouldn't leave, had committed herself to this makeshift family they had built together. But the letter from Boston represented everything she had lost when scandal forced her westward. Professional respect, financial independence, the chance to shape young minds on a grand scale. "I need time to think," Lila said finally, setting the papers carefully on the table. "This changes things in ways I'm still trying to understand." That afternoon, while Ruby worked on her lessons with unusual quiet intensity, Lila and Jesse took a walk along the creek that marked the eastern boundary of his property. The November air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the cottonwood trees along the water had turned the color of burnished gold. "You have to go," Jesse said suddenly, breaking the companionable silence they had maintained for the first half-mile of their walk. "This is the chance you've been waiting for your whole life." Lila stopped walking, turning toward his voice with surprise. "I thought you might ask me to stay." "That's exactly why I can't," he said, and she could hear the pain in his voice despite his attempt to keep it neutral. "If I asked you to stay, you might do it, and then someday you'd wonder what your life might have been if you'd taken the opportunity. I won't be the reason you give up your dreams." It was the most selfless thing anyone had ever said to her, and also the most heartbreaking. Here was a man willing to sacrifice his own happiness to ensure hers, willing to let go of the woman he was coming to love, rather than hold her back from her potential. "What if my dreams have changed?" she asked quietly. "What if what I want now isn't what I wanted 6 months ago?" Jesse was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Lila, what we have here, it's not real life. It's a kind of fairy tale. 3 broken people who found each other and pretended they could make a family out of loneliness and good intentions." "Is that what you think this is?" she asked, stung by his characterization of their life together. "Pretending, I think," he said carefully, "that you're a remarkable woman who deserves a remarkable life. Boston can give you that. Recognition, respect, the chance to influence hundreds of students instead of just one. How can I compete with that?" "You're not competing with anything," Lila said, her voice sharp with frustration. "You're the man who gave me shelter when no one else would, who trusted me with his daughter's heart, who made me feel like I belonged somewhere for the first time in years. How is that not real?" They had reached a stand of trees that created a natural shelter from the wind, and Jesse stopped walking, turning to face her fully. She could sense his internal struggle, could hear it in the careful way he chose his words. "Because I'm a failed rancher who can't even pay his debts, raising a daughter who's been hurt so badly she forgot how to talk for 2 years. I've got nothing to offer you except a struggling ranch and a child who needs more help than I know how to give. And I'm a blind woman who was run out of town because she stood up to a man who was hurting children," Lila countered. "Neither of us is perfect, Jesse, but together we've built something that works. For now," he said, "but what happens when Ruby grows up and doesn't need a teacher anymore? What happens when the ranch fails completely, or when the town finally succeeds in driving us apart? You'll be stuck with a man who couldn't protect the things that mattered to him." The raw pain in his voice told her that they weren't just talking about her decision anymore. They were talking about his wife's death, about his failure to save the woman he had loved, about his fear that he would fail to protect Lila in the same way. "Sarah's death wasn't your fault," she said gently, understanding. Finally, what drove his determination to push her away? And neither was Ruby's silence. "You can't protect people from every possible hurt, Jesse. All you can do is love them and stand by them when the hurts come." "That's not enough," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Love wasn't enough to save. Sarah, love won't be enough to keep you safe from the people in town who want to destroy what we've built here." Lila reached out, her hands finding his face in the gathering dusk, her fingers tracing the strong lines of jaw and cheekbone that she had memorized through weeks of shared meals and quiet conversations. "You're wrong," she said firmly. "Love is the only thing that's ever enough. It's the only thing that matters." Before he could argue further, she rose on her toes and kissed him, pouring all of her certainty and determination into the gentle pressure of her lips against his. For a moment he stood frozen, and then his arms came around her, pulling her close as he kissed her back with a desperation that spoke of months of denied longing. When they finally broke apart, both breathless with the magnitude of what they had acknowledged, Jesse rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "God help me, I love you more than I have any right to." "Then trust me," she said, her hands still framing his face. "Trust that I know my own heart, that I can choose my own future. Trust that what we have here is worth fighting for." And the letter from Boston. Lila was quiet for a moment, thinking of the opportunities that lay spread out on the kitchen table back at the ranch house. Professional vindication, financial security, the chance to return to the world that had shaped her, all of it waiting for her acceptance. "I'll write to them tomorrow," she said finally. "I'll thank them for clearing my name and restoring my credentials, and then I'll tell them that my future lies elsewhere." "Lila." "My choice, Jesse," she said firmly. "My life. My decision. And I choose this. I choose you and Ruby and the life we're building together." As they walked back toward the ranch house through the deepening twilight, Lila felt a peace settle over her that she had never experienced before. The letter from Boston had given her options, but it had also clarified what truly mattered to her. Professional recognition meant nothing without personal connection. Career success felt hollow without people to share it with. Back at the house, Ruby was waiting on the front porch, her small figure silhouetted against the lamplight spilling from the windows. When she saw them approaching together, she ran to meet them, throwing her arms around Lila with the fierce intensity of a child who had been afraid of losing another mother figure. "You're staying," Ruby said, not as a question, but as a statement of absolute certainty. "I can tell by the way you're walking. How do people walk when they're staying?" Lila asked, amused by the child's perception. "Like they belong here," Ruby said simply, "like they're home." As the three of them entered the warm circle of lamplight that defined their shared space, Lila realized that Ruby was exactly right. This was home, not because of the building or the land, but because of the people who had chosen to build a family together out of love rather than obligation. The letter from Boston had offered her a return to her old life, but she had already found something better. She had found a place where she belonged, people who needed her as much as she needed them, and a love that was strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. The second letter arrived 3 days later, carried by a nervous postal clerk who seemed reluctant to deliver it. Unlike the official correspondence from Boston, this envelope bore the return address of a private investigator in Chicago, and its contents would shatter everything Lila thought she knew about her past. Jesse read the sender's information twice before handing the letter to Lila, his voice carefully neutral as he explained its origins. "Says it's from a detective agency, someone named Marcus Sullivan." Lila's hands trembled slightly as she held the envelope. She had never employed a detective, had no business with anyone in Chicago, and couldn't imagine what investigation might concern her. The weight of the envelope suggested multiple pages, official documents that represented weeks or months of careful research. "Shall I read it?" Jesse asked, sensing her reluctance to face whatever revelation lay inside. Ruby, who had been practicing her penmanship at the kitchen table, set down her slate and moved closer to Lila's chair. Over the weeks of living together, the child had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when the adults in her life were facing difficult moments. "Please," Lila said, steeling herself for bad news. In her experience, Unexpected communications from strangers rarely brought good fortune. Jesse's voice was steady as he began to read, but she could hear the puzzlement in his tone. Dear Miss Thompson, my investigation into your family history has uncovered information that I believe you have a right to know. I have been retained by the estate of Augustus Pemberton of Chicago to locate any living descendants of his late business partner, one Thomas Thompson of Boston. Leela's breath caught. Her father's name was Thomas, but he had never mentioned any business partnerships, particularly not with anyone in Chicago. As far as she knew, he had spent his entire adult life as a modest bookshop owner in Boston, struggling to make ends meet while raising a blind daughter alone. Jesse continued reading, his voice growing more amazed with each revelation. According to the documentation I have uncovered, your father and Mr. Pemberton were equal partners in a mining operation in Colorado that proved extraordinarily profitable in the 1860s. Your father's share of the proceeds was held in trust pending his return to claim them, but he never did so. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp or fully comprehend. Her father, a wealthy mining investor? It was so contrary to everything she knew about their life together that she might have dismissed it as a case of mistaken identity, if not for what came next. Mr. Pemberton died last month, and his will included specific instructions that any unclaimed shares belonging to Thomas Thompson should be transferred to his surviving family members. According to my research, you are his sole surviving heir. Jesse's voice faltered slightly as he reached the final paragraph. The amount currently held in trust, including 30 years of accumulated interest and dividends, totals approximately $47,000. I await your instructions regarding the transfer of these funds. The silence that followed was so complete that Lila could hear the ticking of the mantel clock in the front room, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the gaps in the kitchen window frame. $47,000, a sum so enormous that it defied comprehension. More money than most families saw in a lifetime, enough to solve every financial problem they faced and secure comfort for generations to come. That can't be right, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Papa never had money. We lived in 2 rooms above his bookshop, counted every penny. If he had been wealthy... But even as she spoke, memories began surfacing that cast her father's behavior in a different light. The way he had sometimes stood at the window for long periods, staring west with an expression she had never been able to interpret. The careful way he had taught her to manage money, as if preparing her for responsibilities she might someday face. The times she had found him holding a small wooden box that he quickly put away when he realized she was listening. There's more, Jesse said quietly, unfolding what sounded like additional documents. Legal papers, looks like, and something else, feels like a photograph. He described the photograph with the careful detail of someone trying to paint a picture with words. 2 men in their 30s, standing beside what appeared to be a mining operation. One of them was unmistakably her father, younger, broader, through the shoulders, but with the same gentle eyes she remembered from her childhood. The other man was a stranger, but his expensive clothing and confident bearing suggested prosperity and ambition. The legal documents, Jesse continued, they're all signed and witnessed. Partnership agreements, profit-sharing arrangements, even a will that your father filed in Colorado before he left. Everything looks legitimate. Ruby, who had been listening with the wide-eyed fascination of a child witnessing adult mysteries unfold, finally spoke up. Does this mean Miss Lila is rich? The simple question, delivered with a child's direct honesty, brought the reality of the situation into sharp focus. Rich didn't begin to describe what $47,000 represented. It was wealth. Beyond imagination, enough to transform not just their current circumstances, but their entire future. It means, Lila said slowly, trying to process the magnitude of what they had learned, that everything I thought I knew about my father's life was incomplete. Over the following hours, as they read and reread the detective's letter, a picture began to emerge of Thomas Tomsett as a young man hungry for adventure and opportunity. He had travelled west in the early 1860s, partnered with Augustus Pemberton in a silver mining claim that proved extraordinarily profitable and accumulated a fortune that should have set his family up for life. But something had happened to send him back to Boston, back to the modest life of a bookshop owner who never spoke of his Western adventures. The detective's letter hinted at personal tragedy. Pemberton's notes mentioned Thomas receiving news of his wife's illness, his desperate need to return home to care for her. He gave it all up, Lila realized, understanding finally why her father had never claimed his share of the mining profits. Mama was sick, I was just a baby, and he chose family over fortune. Then why didn't he go back later, Jessie asked. After your mother died when you were older. Lila thought of her father in his later years, the way he had thrown himself into community work, the hours he spent teaching literacy to immigrant children at the settlement house. Because by then, he had built a different kind of life, one that mattered more to him than money. The irony was profound and heartbreaking. Her father had possessed the means to give her every advantage, the finest schools, the best medical care for her blindness, a life of comfort and security. Instead, he had chosen to raise her with values that money couldn't buy: integrity, compassion, the understanding that true wealth came from service to others. As the implications of their discovery began to sink in, Ruby asked the question that was troubling all of them. What happens now? It was a fair question and one that required careful consideration. The money was legally hers, but accepting it would change everything about their circumstances. No longer would they be three people struggling against poverty and prejudice, depending on each other for survival. Instead, they would be a wealthy family with options and opportunities that had been unimaginable just hours before. We could pay off the ranch, Jesse said quietly, though his voice carried more uncertainty than relief. Have enough left over to expand the operation, hire help, maybe even build that new house Ruby's been dreaming about. We could travel, Ruby added, her imagination beginning to soar. See Boston, maybe even go to California like Mama always wanted to. But even as they discussed the possibilities, Lila sensed an underlying tension that hadn't been there before. Wealth brought its own complications, its own challenges to the simple life they had built together. Would Jessie still feel comfortable as an equal partner if she had tens of thousands of dollars to her name? Would their relationship survive the shift from mutual dependence to her financial independence? There's something else to consider, she said slowly, voicing the concern that had been growing in her mind. This money comes with obligations. My father never claimed it because he found something more important than wealth. If I accept it, I have to be worthy of that choice. Jessie looked at her with an expression she couldn't see but could feel in the sudden stillness of the air between them. What do you mean? I mean, Lila said, her voice growing stronger as the idea took shape. That perhaps this money isn't meant to solve our problems. Perhaps it's meant to help us solve other people's problems. The subscription school Tom Mitchell had proposed suddenly took on new dimensions. With proper funding, it could become something more than a temporary solution for a few local families. It could become a real institution, a place where children from across the county could receive quality education regardless of their family's ability to pay. We could build a proper schoolhouse, Ruby said, her excitement growing as she grasped the possibilities. With lots of windows and a big library and maybe even a piano for music lessons. We could hire additional teachers, Lila added, her mind racing with plans. Offer scholarships to children whose families couldn't otherwise afford education, maybe even board students from distant ranches. Jessie was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a mixture of admiration and concern. It's a beautiful dream, Lila. But are you sure you want to tie yourself to this place permanently? Once you establish a school here, build that kind of institution, there's no going back to Boston or anywhere else. It was the same question they had faced with the letter from Boston, but with even higher stakes. The money gave her options she had never dreamed of having. The freedom to live anywhere, to pursue any opportunity, to build whatever kind of life she could imagine. But as she sat in the kitchen of the ranch house that had become home, surrounded by the people who had become her chosen family, Lila realized that all the options in the world meant nothing if they took her away from where she belonged. "I'm sure," she said, reaching for Jesse's hand and finding Ruby's small fingers as well. "This is where I want to build something lasting. This is where I want to make my father's sacrifice mean something." As the three of them sat around the kitchen table, holding hands and planning a future that seemed too wonderful to be real, Lila reflected on the strange turns that had brought them to this moment. She had come to Cedar Ridge, expecting to teach school and board with a respectable family. Instead, she had found love, family, and now the means to create something that could outlast all of them. The money would solve their immediate problems, but more importantly, it would allow them to solve problems for others. The school they would build would serve children for generations to come, giving them opportunities that geography and economics might otherwise deny them. But first, there was the small matter of claiming an inheritance from a father who had kept secrets that were only now coming to light, and navigating the complex emotions that came with discovering that everything she thought she knew about her past had been incomplete. The detective's letter had given them far more than money. It had given them a mystery to solve and a legacy to honor. Now they had to figure out how to do both while building the future they all wanted to share. The town meeting was scheduled for the first Tuesday in December, and word of it spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire through dry grass. Mayor Hutchins had called it under the pretense of discussing municipal improvements for the coming year, but everyone knew its true purpose: to address what the mayor's printed notice delicately termed irregularities in local educational arrangements and their impact on community standards. Lila sat at her kitchen table on the Monday evening before the meeting, her fingers tracing the edges of the poem Ruby had written that afternoon. The child's verses, penned in careful handwriting on her best stationery, spoke of families built from love rather than blood, of teachers who saw with their hearts, and of the courage required to stand up for what was right, even when the whole world seemed to be watching. "Are you certain you want to share this tomorrow?" Lila asked, though her heart swelled with pride at the child's determination to speak publicly in defense of their unusual household. Ruby's response was immediate and fierce. "Mama always said that when something matters, you have to be brave. Enough to say so out loud. This matters more than anything." Jesse looked up from the correspondence he had been reviewing, letters of support from Tom Mitchell, the Hendersons, Pastor Williams, and nearly a dozen other families who had quietly but firmly expressed their approval of Lila's teaching and their disgust with the campaign being waged against her. "Dr. Whitmore won't make this easy," he warned, though his voice carried more determination than concern. "He's been building his case for weeks, talking to anyone who'll listen about moral decay and the corruption of innocent children." The irony of Whitmore's position wasn't lost on any of them. Here was a man who had participated in abandoning a qualified teacher at a train station, who was now leading a crusade against the very arrangement that had proven beneficial to every child it touched. Ruby had progressed further in her studies, under Lila's guidance, than she had in 2 years of sporadic instruction from previous teachers. "Let him make his arguments," Lila said, her voice steady despite the anxiety that fluttered in her chest like a caged bird. "We have something better than accusations and insinuations. We have results." The evidence of those results surrounded them. Ruby's slate covered with mathematical equations she had solved independently, her copybook filled with essays that demonstrated not just literacy, but genuine thoughtfulness. the collection of books she had read, each one carefully discussed and analyzed until its lessons became part of her growing understanding of the world. More importantly, they had the transformation that couldn't be measured in academic terms. The silent, withdrawn child who had become a confident young woman capable of defending her beliefs in public. That transformation alone was worth defending. Against any attack the town council might mount. "There's something else we need to discuss," Jessie said, setting aside the letters and fixing both Lila and Ruby with a serious expression. "Something I should have mentioned earlier, but I wanted to be certain before I said anything." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small velvet box that made Lila's breath catch in her throat. Even without seeing it, she could sense its significance in the sudden stillness that fell over the kitchen. "Lila," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I know the timing isn't ideal with everything else we're facing, but I can't go into that meeting tomorrow without you knowing exactly where I stand, exactly what I'm fighting for." Ruby clapped her hands together with delight, apparently having suspected this moment was coming long before the adults had acknowledged it themselves. "Jessie," Lila began, but he gently interrupted her. "Let me say this while I still have the courage," he said, rising from his chair and moving to kneel beside hers. "I love you, Lila Thompson. I love your strength and your wisdom and the way you've brought light into our lives. I love how you've helped Ruby find her voice and given me permission to hope for things I thought I'd lost forever." He took her hands in his, and she could feel them trembling slightly with the magnitude of what he was asking. "I know I'm just a rancher with more debt than assets, and you're a woman who could have anything she wanted, now that your inheritance has changed our circumstances. But if you'll have me, if you'll take a chance on building something permanent, together, I'd be honored to call you my wife." The proposal was everything she had dreamed of and feared in equal measure. Yes, she loved him. Loved his quiet strength, his devotion to Ruby, the way he had opened his home and heart to a stranger without asking for anything in return. But marriage would make their arrangement officially permanent, would eliminate any possibility of retreat if the community's opposition became too overwhelming to bear. "Say yes, Miss Lila," Ruby whispered, her young voice carrying the weight of someone who had already lost one mother and couldn't bear to lose another. "Say yes, so we can be a real family." Looking into Jessie's eyes she couldn't see but whose expression she could feel in the tender way he held her hands, Lila realized that retreat had never really been an option. Her heart had been given months ago, during those first difficult weeks when they had learned to navigate the complex dance of building a family from strangers. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I'll marry you, Jessie Colton. I'll be proud to be your wife and Ruby's mother." The ring was a simple gold band that had belonged to Jessie's grandmother, resized to fit Lila's slender finger. As he slipped it onto her hand, Ruby threw her arms around both adults, creating a circle of connection that felt unbreakable despite the challenges they would face in less than 24 hours. "When?" Ruby asked practically, already planning celebrations in her mind. "After we get through tomorrow," Jessie said, though his smile was evident in his voice. "After we've shown this town that what we've built together is worth defending." The evening was spent in careful preparation for the confrontation they all knew was coming. They reviewed the letters of support, discussed the points Lila would make about the value of individualized education, and prepared Ruby for the possibility that some adults might say unkind things about their family arrangements. "Remember," Lila told the child as they practiced the poem one final time, "we're not trying to change the minds of people who are determined to hate us. We're speaking to the people who might be willing to listen, who might recognize that love makes families, just as surely as blood does." That night, after Ruby had gone to bed clutching the wooden doll that had become her talisman against uncertainty, Jessie and Lila sat on the front porch despite the December chill. They talked quietly about their hopes for the school they wanted to build, the life they planned to share, the children they might raise together in the house that had become a sanctuary for all of them. "Are you afraid?" Jessie asked as they prepared to go inside. Lila considered the question seriously. Tomorrow would bring public scrutiny of their most private decisions, would force them to defend their right to love each other and raise Ruby together. There would be accusations and insinuations, attempts to shame them into conformity with expectations that had no bearing on the reality of their daily lives. "I'm afraid of losing what we've built," she admitted, "but I'm more afraid of not fighting for it. Ruby deserves to grow up in a world where different kinds of families are accepted, where people are judged by their character rather than their circumstances. And if we lose, if the town council decides they have the authority to break us apart," Lila reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in the gesture that had become their private signal of unity. "Then we'll go somewhere else and build it again. But Jessie, I don't think we're going to lose. I think there are more good people in Cedar Ridge than bad ones, and tomorrow we're going to find out who they are." As they prepared for bed in their separate rooms, maintaining the propriety that had kept gossip from becoming scandal, both of them felt the weight of the coming day settling over them like a heavy blanket. Tomorrow would determine not just their personal future, but the future of every child who might benefit from the school they hoped to establish. The inheritance from her father had given them the means to build something lasting, but money alone wouldn't be enough if the community remained hostile to their presence. They needed acceptance, or at least tolerance, from enough families to make the school viable. More than that, they needed the town to recognize that their arrangement, unconventional though it might be, had produced results that spoke for themselves. Ruby's transformation from a silent, wounded child to a confident young woman was proof that love could heal what traditional approaches had failed to touch. In her small bedroom, Ruby lay awake, practicing the words she would speak the next day, determined to show the adults of Cedar Ridge that their disapproval meant nothing compared to the family she had found in Jessie and Lila. She had already lost one mother to forces beyond her control. She would not lose another to prejudice and fear. And in the master bedroom that had once belonged to Sarah Colton, Jessie stared at the ceiling and wondered if he had the right to ask two women he loved to fight a battle that might cost them everything. But even as doubt whispered in his mind, he knew that retreat was impossible. Some things were worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. Tomorrow would bring the test that would determine whether Cedar Ridge was ready to accept the kind of family they had become, or whether they would have to find their future elsewhere. But tonight, they were together under one roof, bound by love and commitment and the shared determination to protect what they had built. The town meeting would be their trial by fire, but they would face it as they had faced everything else, together, united by bonds that no amount of social pressure could break. The Cedar Ridge Town Hall had never seen a crowd quite like the one that gathered on that cold December evening. By 6 o'clock, every seat was filled, and people stood along the walls, their conversations creating a low hum of anticipation that spoke of a community divided against itself. Lila could hear the distinct groupings even before Jessie guided her to the seats Tom Mitchell had saved for them in the third row. Supporters clustered on the left side of the room, opposition gathered on the right, with a handful of undecided citizens scattered throughout. Mayor Hutchins called the meeting to order with the oversized gavel that had belonged to his predecessor, striking it against the podium with unnecessary force. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot, causing several children in the audience to jump with surprise. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hutchins began, his voice carrying the pompous authority of a man who enjoyed being the center of attention. "We're here tonight to address concerns that have been raised about certain arrangements in our community that may not be in keeping with the moral standards we strive to maintain." Lila felt Jessie's hand find hers, a gesture of solidarity that she needed more than she had anticipated. Despite all their preparation, facing the collective judgment of an entire community was more daunting than any classroom full of skeptical students had ever been. "Before we hear from those who have requested time to speak," Hutchins continued. I think it's important to establish exactly what we're discussing here. We have a situation where an unmarried woman is living under the same roof as an unmarried man and his child with no proper supervision or chaperoning. This arrangement has been defended as an educational necessity, but I think we all know it represents something far more problematic. Dr. Whitmore rose from his seat in the front row, his medical bag conspicuously placed at his feet as a reminder of his professional standing in the community. If I may, Mayor Hutchins, I'd like to address the educational claims that have been made to justify this irregular situation. Please proceed, Doctor. Whitmore's voice carried the measured authority of someone accustomed to being believed without question. As a member of the school board and a concerned citizen, I've made it my business to investigate Miss Thompson's qualifications and methods. While she may have taught in Boston, we have only her word regarding her competence and the appropriateness of her instruction. Lila felt anger rise in her chest, but Jessie's gentle pressure on her hand reminded her to wait for her turn to respond. They had agreed that losing control of her emotions would only play into their opponent's hands. Furthermore, Whitmore continued, we must consider the example being set for our children. What message does it send when we allow unmarried adults to cohabitate under the pretense of education? Are we teaching our young people that moral boundaries can be ignored when it's convenient? A murmur of agreement rippled through the right side of the room, punctuated by a few vocal amens from the church ladies who had made opposition to Layla, their personal crusade. I'd like to present evidence of the harmful effects this arrangement has had on at least one child, Whitmore said, reaching into his bag to withdraw what appeared to be a leather-bound journal. Young Ruby Colton has been exhibiting signs of emotional disturbance that I believe are directly related to the confusing and inappropriate situation in her home. Ruby, who had been sitting quietly between Jessie and Lila, suddenly straightened in her chair. This was not part of the attack they had anticipated, and Lila could feel the child's distress in the way her small body went rigid with tension. I have here, Whitmore continued, holding up the journal with dramatic flair, observations from reliable witnesses who have noted the child's inappropriate attachment to Miss Thompson, her resistance to proper female supervision, and her increasingly willful behavior since coming under the teacher's influence. That's not true, Ruby said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet room. Miss Lila didn't make me willful, she made me brave. You see, Whitmore said, as if Ruby's spirited defense had proved his point. This is exactly the kind of disrespectful behavior that results from irregular influences. A properly raised child would never speak out of turn in an adult gathering. The comment was a mistake that revealed more about Whitmore's character than about Ruby's upbringing. Several parents in the audience shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that the doctor's vision of childhood required a submission that most of them found excessive. Tom Mitchell stood up from his seat near the back of the room. If I may, Mayor Hutchins, I'd like to address Dr. Whitmore's concerns about Miss Thompson's qualifications. Mr. Mitchell, this is irregular. So was leaving a qualified teacher stranded at a train station, Mitchell interrupted, his voice cutting through the mayor's protestations. But we did that anyway, and Jessie Colton was decent enough to clean up our mess. A rustle of movement went through the crowd as people turned to look at Mitchell, a man whose opinion carried weight due to his ranch's success and his reputation for fairness in business dealings. My boy was hurt bad a few months back, Mitchell continued, and Miss Thompson's quick thinking and steady hands probably saved his life. She knew more about head injuries than most doctors I've met, and she stayed by his bedside for hours, making sure he was properly cared for. Medical treatment is hardly the same as education, Whitmore objected. No, it's better, Mitchell shot back. It shows character. And I'll tell you something else. My boy learned more from Miss Thompson in the 2 days she watched over him than he'd learned in the previous 6 months of sporadic schooling we've managed to cobble together in this town. Sarah Henderson rose from her seat, her hands smoothing her skirts with the nervous energy of someone unaccustomed to public speaking. I'd like to say something, if I may. Mayor Hutchins looked as if he wanted to refuse, but too many eyes were on him to ignore such a reasonable request from one of the town's most respected matrons. Mrs. Henderson, you have the floor. I've been watching this situation unfold for months now, Sarah began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. I've seen Ruby Colton transform from a child who wouldn't speak to anyone into a confident young lady who can read and write better than children twice her age. I've seen Jesse Colton, who was drowning in grief and responsibility, become a man, with hope in his eyes again. She paused, looking directly at Lila, with an expression of support that was visible to everyone in the room. And I've seen Miss Thompson prove over and over again that she's exactly the kind of teacher our children need. Patient, intelligent, and devoted to their success rather than her own convenience. If we're going to judge this arrangement, let's judge it by its results rather than our prejudices. Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Whitmore said, his voice carrying a warning that everyone recognized. Surely you're not suggesting that we ignore proper moral standards simply because... I'm suggesting, Sarah interrupted with uncharacteristic firmness, that we examine our own moral standards before we condemn others. What's moral about abandoning someone in need? What's proper about denying children education because we're afraid of what the neighbors might think? Ruby tugged on Lila's sleeve, and when Lila bent down, the child whispered, "May I read my poem now?" The request was both touching and terrifying. Ruby had prepared her verses as a defense of their family, but subjecting an 8-year-old to the hostile scrutiny of adults who had already demonstrated their capacity for cruelty seemed almost unbearable. "Are you certain, sweetheart?" Lila whispered back. "It might be difficult." "I'm certain," Ruby said, her voice carrying a determination that reminded Lila powerfully of Jesse in his most resolute moments. "Some things are too important to leave." "Unsaid?" Lila looked at Jesse, who nodded slowly, despite the worry evident in his expression. If Ruby was brave enough to speak, they would be brave enough to let her. "Mayor Hutchins," Lila said, rising from her seat, "my student has prepared something she'd like to share with the community. I believe her voice deserves to be heard in a discussion that will determine her future." The mayor's discomfort was obvious, but refusing to hear from a child would make him appear even more unreasonable than he already did. "Very well, but keep it brief." Ruby stood and walked to the front of the room with the measured steps of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her mind dozens of times. She unfolded her paper with careful precision, cleared her throat, and began to read in a voice that carried to every corner of the suddenly silent hall. "This is called What Makes a Family," she announced, then began the verses that would change everything. "Some families are born from the same blood and name, but others are chosen when love breaks through shame. Some mothers and fathers are given by birth, but the best ones are found by proving their worth. My first mama loved me but couldn't stay. Death took her from us one terrible day. I thought I was broken, forgot how to speak. Papa was lonely. We both were so weak. Then came Miss Lila with wisdom and grace, who saw past my silence and lit up our place. She didn't need eyes to see Papa's pain. She didn't need blood to heal hearts again." The poem continued, each stanza building a case for love over convention, for character over circumstance, for the kind of family that chose itself rather than accepting what accident provided. When Ruby finished, the silence in the room was profound and transformative. Dr. Whitmore was the first to break it, his voice tight with frustration. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. A child so confused by irregular influences that she's been convinced abnormal arrangements are preferable to proper family structures." But his words fell flat in the face of Ruby's obvious confidence and articulacy. Here was no confused or damaged child, but a young woman who understood exactly what she was defending and why it mattered. Pastor Williams stood up from his seat in the middle section, a movement that caused a ripple of surprise throughout the assembled crowd. As the spiritual leader of Cedar Ridge's largest congregation, his opinion would carry enormous weight in any debate about moral standards and proper behavior. "If I may," he said, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of delivering sermons to the very people now hanging on his words, "I think we need to address something that's been troubling me about this entire discussion." Mayor Hutchins nodded eagerly, clearly expecting support from the religious establishment. "Of course, Pastor Williams, your guidance in this matter would be most welcome." But Williams's next words caught everyone by surprise, including his own parishioners, who thought they knew where he stood on matters of conventional morality. "We've spent this evening talking about propriety and standards," he began, his gaze moving slowly across the divided room. "But I haven't heard anyone mention the actual commandments we're supposed to follow as Christians. Love thy neighbor, care for the widow and orphan, judge not, lest ye be judged." Dr. Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing that the pastor's support wasn't going to materialize as expected. "When I look at the Colton household," Williams continued, "I see a man who opened his home to someone in need. I see a woman who has devoted herself to caring for a grieving child. I see a family that has formed itself around love and service rather than mere convention. If that's not Christian behavior, then I need to reread my Bible." The pastor's words created a visible division in his own congregation, with some nodding in agreement, while others looked scandalized by his defense of the irregular arrangement. "Furthermore," Williams said, his voice growing stronger, "I've watched Ruby Colton grow from a silent, wounded child into a confident young woman under Miss Thompson's care. If we're going to judge this situation, let's judge it by its fruits, as Scripture tells us to do." Jesse stood up beside Lila, his hand still holding hers as he faced the community that would decide their fate. "If I may say something in my own defense," he said, his voice carrying across the room with quiet dignity, "I'm not an educated man like Dr. Whitmore, and I'm not a leader like Mayor Hutchins. I'm just a rancher trying to raise his daughter right and make an honest living. When I found Miss Thompson abandoned at that train station, I had a choice: walk away and let someone else deal with the problem, or do what my late wife would have wanted me to do." His voice caught slightly at the mention of Sarah, but he continued with steady determination. "Sarah always said that family wasn't about blood. It was about commitment. She would have welcomed Miss Thompson into our home without a second thought, and she would have been proud to see how Lila has helped our daughter heal." "That's all very touching," Dr. Whitmore interjected, "but sentiment doesn't change the fact that your arrangement violates every standard of proper—" "Doctor?" came a voice from the back of the room that silenced Whitmore mid-sentence. Everyone turned to see Augustus Henderson, Sarah's husband and one of the most successful businessmen in town, rising to his feet with the slow deliberation of someone who rarely spoke in public but commanded attention when he did. "I've listened to enough," Henderson said, his voice carrying the weight of unquestionable authority. "Miss Thompson saved young Tom Mitchell's life when he was thrown from his horse. She's taught my nephew Billy more in 2 months of private lessons than he learned in a year of regular schooling. And she's done all of this while maintaining the kind of dignity and moral character that most of us can only aspire to." He paused, looking directly at Dr. Whitmore with an expression that could have frozen water in July. "If you want to talk about standards, Doctor, let's talk about the standard of abandoning a qualified teacher at a train station because she's different from what you expected. Let's talk about the standard of attacking a family that's done nothing but help this community." The room erupted in a mixture of applause and angry murmurs, with the supporters finally finding their collective voice, while the opposition struggled to maintain their moral high ground in the face of such direct criticism. Mayor Hutchins pounded his gavel repeatedly, calling for order while clearly losing control of the proceedings. "Gentlemen, ladies, please, we need to maintain decorum." But decorum was the last thing on Ruby's mind as she stepped forward again, her small face fierce with the righteousness of childhood. "You want to vote about whether Miss Lila can stay in our town?" she asked, her voice cutting through the noise. With startling clarity, the room fell quiet again, all attention focused on the 8-year-old who had become the unlikely center of the evening's drama. "Then let's vote," Ruby continued, pulling a folded paper from her pocket. "But first, you should know that Miss Lila doesn't just want to stay in our family. She wants to start a real school here, with her own money, for any child whose parents want them to have a proper education." The announcement hit the room like a thunderbolt. Lila felt her breath catch. This wasn't part of what they had planned to reveal tonight. But Ruby, with the instinctive wisdom of childhood, had realized that their opponent's arguments would crumble in the face of such generosity. "Ruby," Lila said quietly. But the child continued with the momentum of someone who knew she held the winning card. "She inherited money from her father," Ruby announced to the stunned assembly. "Enough money to build a schoolhouse and hire teachers and buy books for every child in the county. But she wants to do it here in Cedar Ridge because this is her home now." The silence that followed was electric with possibility. Parents who had been uncertain about the propriety of the Colton household suddenly found themselves calculating the value of free education for their children. Even some of Dr. Whitmore's strongest supporters began to shift uncomfortably as they realized what they might be throwing away. Jesse stepped forward to stand beside Ruby, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "What my daughter says is true. Lila has come into a substantial inheritance, and she wants to use it to benefit this community. But she's not going to invest in a place that doesn't want her." "We want her!" called out Tom Mitchell from the back of the room. "Absolutely," added Sarah Henderson. "Cedar Ridge needs that school," shouted someone else. But Dr. Whitmore wasn't ready to concede defeat. "Money doesn't change the fundamental moral issues at stake here," he said, rising to his feet with obvious desperation. "We can't allow our standards to be bought and paid for, regardless of how generous the offer might be." "No," said Lila, finally standing to address the room directly. "You can't buy moral standards, but you can recognize them when you see them." Her voice was calm and clear, carrying the authority of someone who had faced far worse opposition than a roomful of frontier prejudice. "I came to Cedar Ridge to teach children. Instead, I found something I never expected, a place where I belonged, people who accepted me for who I am, rather than what I lack. Jesse and Ruby gave me a family when I thought I would spend my life alone." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "I don't need your approval to love them or to make a life with them. But I would like your cooperation in building something that could benefit every family in this community. The choice is yours." Mayor Hutchins, sensing that the tide had turned decisively against the opposition, called for the vote that would determine not just the fate of one unconventional family, but the future of education in Cedar Ridge. All those in favor of accepting Miss Thompson's proposal to establish a subscription school and of recognizing her right to live according to her own conscience, please raise your hands. The response was overwhelming. Hand after hand rose throughout the hall until even some of Dr. Whitmore's original supporters found themselves voting in favor of the proposal. When the count was finished, the margin of victory was so decisive that a formal tally seemed unnecessary. Ruby clapped her hands together with delight, while Jessie pulled Lila into an embrace that declared their victory to the entire community. They had not only won acceptance for their family, but had gained support for the dream that would define the rest of their lives together. As the crowd began to disperse, people approached them with congratulations, offers of help, and tentative inquiries about enrollment in the new school. The battle was over, and they had emerged not just victorious, but welcomed into the community they had chosen to call home. 6 months later, On a warm spring morning in 1883, the sound of children's laughter echoed across the newly constructed schoolyard of the Tomset Colton Academy. Lila stood on the front steps of the building that had risen from prairie grass and determination, listening to the music of learning that filled the air, the recitation of multiplication tables, the scratch of chalk on slate, the excited discussion of a geography lesson that had captured young imaginations. 32 students enrolled for the fall term, Ruby announced, settling beside her stepmother on the wooden steps they had shared so many afternoons. At 9 years old, Ruby had grown into her role as both student and teaching assistant, helping younger children with their letters while mastering Latin and advanced mathematics herself. 32 minds eager to learn, Lila corrected gently, the distinction important to someone who had spent her life believing that every child deserved the chance to reach their potential, each one different, each one precious. The school building itself was modest but well-designed, with large windows that captured the Texas light and a bell tower that could be heard across the county when it rang to signal the start of each day's lessons. Inside, 3 classrooms accommodated students from primer level through preparatory academy, with plans to add a 4th room when enrollment demanded it. Jesse approached from the direction of the barn where he had been tending to the horses that belonged to students who rode in from distant ranches. Marriage had transformed him from a struggling widower into a confident family man whose ranch now prospered under careful management and the security that came with Lila's inheritance properly invested. Mrs. Patterson was by earlier, he said, settling on the step below them with the easy familiarity of a man completely comfortable in his own skin. Wanted to enroll her youngest for the fall term. Ruby giggled at the irony. The same Mrs. Patterson who said Miss Lila shouldn't even be allowed to stay at her hotel. The very same, Jessie confirmed. Seems having the finest school in 3 counties right in her backyard has a way of changing people's perspectives. It was true that success had silenced many of their former critics. The Tomset Colton Academy had attracted attention from educational authorities as far away as Austin, who praised its innovative methods and impressive results. Dr. Whitmore, faced with the reality of his own children's inferior education at the county school, had quietly approached them about private tutoring, though his pride prevented him from making a formal apology for his earlier opposition. Speaking of changing perspectives, Lila said, reaching into her pocket to withdraw a letter that had arrived that morning. This came from Boston. Jessie and Ruby both recognized the return address, Lila's former supervisor who had continued to correspond with her about educational matters despite her decision to remain in Texas. The Massachusetts Board of Education wants to send a delegation to observe our methods, Lila explained, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and amazement. They're particularly interested in our approach to teaching students with different learning abilities. The Academy had indeed become known for its success with children who struggled in traditional settings. Lila's understanding of how minds could work differently, gained through her own experience with blindness, had proven invaluable in reaching students others had written off as slow or difficult. "Will you agree to the visit?" Jessie asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Of course," Lila replied. "If our work here can help children in other places, we have an obligation to share what we've learned." As the afternoon progressed and students began departing for their homes across the county, the 3 of them walked through the empty classrooms, reviewing the day's accomplishments and planning tomorrow's lessons. The walls were covered with student work, essays, drawings, mathematical proofs, maps of distant countries that sparked dreams of adventure and discovery. In the corner of the main classroom stood a piano that had been donated by the Henderson family, where Lila taught music lessons that had revealed unexpected talents among her students. Ruby had proven particularly gifted, her clear voice often leading the group singing that began each day. "I have something to tell you both," Jessie said, as they locked up the building and began walking toward the house they had expanded to accommodate their growing family. Tom Mitchell offered to buy the south pasture for more than it's worth. Says he wants to build a house close to the school so his children can attend more easily. It was a common story. Families relocating to Cedar Ridge specifically to access the education their children couldn't receive elsewhere. The town was growing, prospering in ways that benefited everyone who had shown the courage to embrace change rather than resist it. "There's something else," Ruby said, her voice carrying the excitement of someone with important news to share. "I've been thinking about what I want to study when I'm older, after I finish here." Both adults turned their attention to her, curious about the direction her thoughts had taken. "I want to be a teacher like Miss Lila," she announced, "not just because she's wonderful, but because I want to help children who are different, like I was when I couldn't talk. I want them to know that being different doesn't mean being less." Lila felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the profound satisfaction of knowing that her influence would extend beyond her own classroom through the child she had helped raise. Ruby's decision represented the ultimate validation of everything they had built together. "That's a worthy ambition," Jessie said, his voice thick with paternal pride. "Your mama, both your mamas, would be proud of the woman you're becoming." As they reached the house that had become the heart of their expanding world, Lila reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had arrived in Cedar Ridge as a rejected teacher with nowhere else to go, had found herself abandoned at a train station by people too afraid to take a chance on someone different. Now she was Mrs. Jessie Colton, principal of an academy that attracted students from across Texas, mother to a daughter who would carry their values forward into the next generation. The broken pieces of 3 separate lives had been reassembled into something stronger and more beautiful than any of them could have achieved alone. "Do you ever regret it?" Jessie asked as they settled on the front porch for the evening ritual that had become their favorite time together. "Giving up Boston, staying here when you could have had anything you wanted?" Lila considered the question seriously, as she always did when Jessie sought reassurance about the choices they had made together. In Boston, she might have achieved professional recognition on a grand scale, might have influenced educational policy, might have become a name remembered in academic circles. But sitting here with her husband's hand in hers and her daughter's, head against her shoulder, surrounded by the sounds of a community that had learned to embrace difference rather than fear it, she knew without question that she had found something more valuable than fame or recognition. "I got everything I wanted," she said simply. "I just didn't know what I wanted until I found it." Ruby stirred against her shoulder, not quite asleep despite the long day. "Tell the story again," she requested drowsily. "About how you met Papa at the train station." "Once upon a time," Lila began, her voice carrying the cadence of all the best stories, "there was a blind teacher who thought she was lost, until a cowboy and his daughter showed her that she was exactly where she belonged." As the story unfolded, in the gathering dusk, punctuated by the distant sounds of cattle and the evening calls of birds settling for the night, all 3 of them understood that they were living in the best possible ending to their tale. Not because their lives were perfect, but because they had learned that love was indeed the only thing that mattered, the only force strong enough to transform strangers into family and adversity into opportunity. The train station where their story began was less than 5 miles away, still welcoming travelers who arrived with hopes and dreams and uncertain futures. But for the Colton family, that platform represented not a destination, but a beginning, the place where 3 lost souls had found each other and decided to build something lasting together. In the years that followed, as their school grew and their influence spread, as Ruby matured into the teacher she had dreamed of becoming and new children joined their extended family, they would often return to that simple platform, not from nostalgia but from gratitude. grateful for the circumstances that had brought them together, grateful for the courage to love beyond convention, grateful for the wisdom to recognize that home was not a place, but a choice, made new, each day through commitment to those who mattered most. The academy bell would ring again tomorrow, calling students to lessons that would shape not just their minds, but their characters. The Colton family would continue their work of proving that different kinds of families could thrive, that love was stronger than prejudice, that courage could indeed change the world one heart at a time. But tonight, they were simply three people who had found each other against all odds, sitting together on a front porch in Texas, watching the stars emerge in a sky as vast and full of possibility as the love that had brought them home.